When she walked through the door that night, smiling as if the world still made sense, I already knew. The silence between us was saturated with lies she pretended not to notice. I sat on the couch and, in a firm voice, asked, "How long has this been going on?" She paused, as if time had frozen around her. She feigned surprise, tried to deflect, asked what I was talking about. But I was already exhausted from asking questions she only answered with half-truths. I showed her the image on my phone, her sitting in an elegant restaurant, facing a man who wasn't me, the two of us laughing, exchanging glances as if in a romance novel. There was no room for explanations. I didn't want to hear excuses that would only deepen the hole she'd dug between us. All I could say was what had been clutching my chest for weeks: "I loved you with all my heart, but apparently I wasn't enough. I hope you're very happy." I left the house without looking back. Not because I was strong, but because if I did, maybe I'd come back. And she didn't deserve this anymore. That night, I felt like someone who had given everything they had and still found it wanting. I believed in promises, I trusted in time, I surrendered my dreams, my body, and my most vulnerable moments to someone who, in the end, didn't have the courage to tell me to my face that they preferred someone else. I was left with the bitter taste of having been replaced, like an old book forgotten on the shelf, while she lost herself in the pages of a new story I barely knew. And the cruelest thing was realizing that I would have gone all the way for us, while she was already at a different starting point, silent, smiling at another man as if I were just a poorly written chapter in her life. Nothing in the world hurts as much as loving someone who replaces you before saying goodbye. For days, months, I walked like a ghost through the corridors of my own life. I slept, woke, ate, but I wasn't present. People spoke to me, but the words passed like wind. I relived the moments, the memories, the gestures that now felt false. How had I not noticed before? How had I been blind to so many signs? The cell phone always face down. The laughs that no longer included my name. The excuses to go out alone. The hugs that lasted less. The rush to hang up. She was already leaving long before that night. I was only the last to realize. And deep down, that's the worst part, feeling like you're left fighting alone for something the other had abandoned long ago. But life, even after an earthquake, forces you to move on. Little by little, I began rebuilding my routine, my space, my dignity. I left the house we shared, moved the furniture, deleted the photos, and stored the memories in a box I preferred never to open again. Until one day, on a random afternoon, I reconnected with a woman from the past. An old flame, the kind we let go of due to poor timing, pride, or distraction. She, too, was marked by an abrupt end. Her husband had left her, just as I had been left. It was as if two wounds had collided midway. It wasn't haste, it wasn't necessity, it was recognition. We saw each other with the eyes of those who know what it's like to be forgotten. And, little by little, we began to rebuild ourselves in each other. With her, things were different. There was respect in the eyes, listening in the silences, touching on the details. I didn't need to explain myself, I didn't need to prove my worth. For the first time in a long time, I felt seen. Loved completely, cleanly. She was in no rush to forget the past, and I didn't demand that she hide her pain. We healed each other with simple gestures, a hot coffee, a sincere hug, a genuine good morning. It wasn't explosive passion, it was cultivated affection. It was a kind of love that isn't built overnight, but blossoms amidst the rubble of those who have already been broken. And then, like everything that returns when it's no longer expected, my ex-wife reappeared. I saw her in the same place where she used to wait for me with smiles before everything fell apart. She was different. Her eyes, once filled with arrogance and certainty, now seemed frightened, insecure, almost childish. The man she had left me for was not by her side. I learned from others that he treated her coldly, that he made a point of showing her that she was just another man, that the promises she believed so strongly in were nothing more than a whim. Irony of fate, she left someone who loved her to throw herself into the arms of someone who only wanted fleeting company. And now, there, standing before me, there was pain. Real pain. The pain of someone who lost something they thought was eternal. She sought me out. She said she wanted to talk. For the first time, she spoke softly, without defenses. She asked for forgiveness. She said she only understood what I meant to her when she lost me. That she only recognized the value of what we shared when she had to face the emptiness of a relationship that wasn't love, but vanity. She said she thought about me every day. That she still loved me. That she wanted to try again. I listened to everything. Carefully, respectfully. I wasn't there to hurt her, nor to throw in her face everything she'd done to me. Because, despite the pain she'd caused me, I no longer held any hatred. I had learned, with great difficulty, that forgiving isn't about going back. Forgiving is about moving on. I looked her in the eye, took a deep breath, and told her I forgave her. That I understood her mistakes. But now it was too late. Because I had found someone who chose me from the first glance. Someone who arrived without promises and offered me truth. And that, above all, I couldn't betray the pure love I was building because of a belated regret. She cried. She cried in a way I'd never seen before. It wasn't a tantrum, it wasn't drama, it was genuine pain. The pain of someone who realizes, too late, that true love doesn't wait forever. That while she was playing at finding herself, I had already left in search of peace. I hugged her. For the last time. And it was in that embrace that I understood that betrayal doesn't just destroy the betrayed. It also shatters the betrayer, when they realize what they let slip away. Time passed. She never looked for me again. I saw her from afar a few times, her eyes lost, like someone carrying a what if that will never fade. I, on the other hand, continue experiencing a new love, not because I wanted to forget the old one, but because I decided to remember who I am. The pain passed. So did the longing. But the lesson was forever engraved. Those who trade true love for an adventure end up learning, the hard way, that not every regret comes back. But what did she do after that conversation? Did she try to win back the man who disappointed her? Could she move on alone? Or did she, once again, look for someone to fill the void she created? Because deep down, some losses cannot be recovered. And she lost more than a man, she lost the only person who still looked at her as if she were the beginning of everything. And that's where the Betrayal story begins. Welcome to the channel. Here, betrayal never will be romanticized, because those who truly love, don't deceive. All the stories you hear are fiction, but they carry a profound truth. Betrayal destroys lives, hearts and families. Our goal is to show, with emotion and realism, the price you pay for bad choices. Get ready now to dive into a story intense, shocking and unforgettable. Because some decisions, there is no going back. Her name was Julia. She was 32 years old, with large, restless eyes, the kind that always seemed to be searching for something more, something she perhaps didn't even know what it was. She had an easy, polite, almost practiced smile, like someone who had spent her life pleasing without truly giving herself over. She worked as a coordinator at a private school and was admired by her colleagues, for her elegance, her organization, her self-control. Some said Julia was a lucky woman. A good profession, stability, discreet beauty, and a husband who was, without exaggeration, everything a woman could ask for. His name was Daniel, 35 years old, a civil engineer, one of those silent, gentle men who prefer to observe before speaking. He wasn't expansive, but he had a firm, steady presence, the kind that comforts without needing to say much. He loved Julia with a quiet dedication, present in details almost no one saw. And perhaps that was his mistake. Small, repeated gestures can seem invisible when the other becomes too accustomed to them. Their relationship had begun almost 10 years ago. They met at a cafe, by chance, on a rainy afternoon when she had forgotten her umbrella, and he offered her his. Julia, at the time, was coming out of a turbulent relationship, marked by arguments, absences, and broken promises. Daniel emerged as the opposite of everything she had known: patient, kind, someone who didn't try to win her over with words, but with actions. He wasn't intense, but he was constant. And Julia, tired of loves that came with sparks and disappeared with the wind, surrendered herself to him like someone finding shelter after a storm. It was a love built calmly. She allowed herself to trust. He allowed himself to dream. And within a few years, they were married. The apartment they lived in was small but comfortable. The walls were covered in travel photos, scribbled notes with good morning messages and grocery lists. Their bedroom smelled of lavender, with curtains that let in soft morning light, and a closet divided almost mathematically, half for her, half for him, with a smaller space for their shared belongings. On weekends, Daniel would make breakfast while Julia was still in bed. The clank of cutlery in the kitchen, the smell of fresh coffee, the slightly burnt toast, were part of a ritual that repeated itself without much change. It was a safe, peaceful routine, of someone who believed that love is also repetition. Julia, on the other hand, had a more volatile energy. Despite her restrained appearance, she was restless on the inside. She enjoyed novelty, small changes, new challenges. She was the type who would move furniture around when she felt something inside her was out of place. She had friends she spoke to almost daily, and amidst the conversations about work, children, and politics, she often let slip a certain dissatisfaction that even she couldn't name. It wasn't about her husband. She never spoke of him with resentment. On the contrary, she always said Daniel was wonderful. And he was. But there was something inside her that insisted on questioning whether what she was experiencing was truly all that love had to offer. When someone is at peace on the outside but at war on the inside, choices are often silent, almost imperceptible, until they become irreversible. Daniel, though more reserved, was deeply attentive. He noticed when she returned from work more silently, when the goodnight kiss came in a rush, when her eyes seemed elsewhere during dinner. But he was never the type to question things out loud. He believed that love also meant respecting the other person's silence. And perhaps it was there, in that misinterpreted respect, that the distance began to set in. Not with fights, nor with indifference. But with empty spaces that opened between them without either of them realizing it. The bed was still shared, dinners still happened, birthdays were celebrated. But there was a subtle sense that something had changed. As if they were together, but in opposite directions. There were nights when Julia would wake up, sleepless, and go to the balcony to gaze at the empty street. The cars passing in the distance, the streetlights illuminating the empty sidewalks, the silence of the early morning, it all made her wonder if she'd chosen the right life. And it wasn't that she was unhappy. But was it enough? She wondered if love really was this lukewarm stability, this calm that sometimes felt like anesthesia. In contrast, Daniel continued doing everything he always had. He texted her throughout the day asking if she needed anything. He'd fill up her car before she realized it was empty. He'd put on her favorite series to record even though he hadn't intended to watch it. But Julia's eyes no longer saw these things with the same brightness they once had. And this, more than anything, was the harbinger of an abyss. In the eyes of others, they were a model couple. Neighbors admired their relationship, friends praised their partnership, and even Julia's parents, who initially suspected Daniel of being overly calm, came to see him as the ideal son-in-law. But no one knew what was going on behind the scenes. The emotional absences, the hidden thoughts, the glances that avoided meeting for long periods of time. Julia, in her professional and social routine, maintained an impeccable appearance. She never showed weakness, always focused, always smiling in the right places. But there were times when you found yourself staring at your phone, waiting for a message you didn't know who it was from. And when you realized it, you felt a mixture of guilt and emptiness. Daniel, on the other hand, was beginning to feel something unraveling. He couldn't explain it, but there was a silent unease that followed him. He felt like he was losing something that still had no name. When she said she was too tired to talk, he pretended to understand. When she spent hours locked in her office, claiming to be busy, he simply left a coffee at the door. When she forgot important dates, he smiled and said he didn't care. But she did. A lot. He just didn't know how to talk about it without sounding fragile. And in this constant effort not to be a burden, he gradually lost his presence. His love was too light for someone who wanted to be shaken. As time passed, the house began to lose the sound of long conversations and spontaneous laughter. Meals became quieter, Sundays longer, glances more fleeting. Julia grew increasingly distant, immersed in commitments, meetings, and dinners that didn't include Daniel. He grew increasingly withdrawn, preferring silence to the discomfort of a conversation that might end in confession. They still loved each other, but they no longer knew how to reach each other. What was once affection became politeness. What was once desire became habit. And so, without realizing it, they began to lose each other. Nights became more about absence than touch. Smiles became formal, automatic. Time continued, and they continued living side by side, like two parallel lines that never intersect. Neither of them knew exactly when it had begun, but they knew they were no longer the same. Julia, despite everything, still admired him. And Daniel, even realizing the distance, still loved her. But love, when not nurtured with presence and truth, slumbers. And sometimes, when you wake up, it's already too late. They were on the edge of what's called the comfort zone. That space where nothing hurts, but also nothing moves. And when you reach that point, everything can change with a single look. A gesture. A choice. And Julia, even without knowing it, was already moving towards that point. Unhurriedly. Without apparent guilt. Simply carried away by the absence of what was once presence. Meanwhile, Daniel continued to believe it was all just a phase. That their love would endure the silence. Little did he know that silence, sometimes, is the last sound before the end. Julia started coming home later. At first, she said it was unexpected meetings, urgent matters, school demands that required her presence after hours. Daniel believed her. Not out of naivete, but because he wanted to believe. He always had. He preferred to trust rather than imagine otherwise. Dinners would go cold on the table while he watched television alone, the sound low and his gaze distant, lost in the clock hands that seemed to turn more slowly when she was away. When she finally walked in the door, she would smile hurriedly, apologize, say she was exhausted. Sometimes she would throw herself on the couch, sometimes she would go straight to the shower. When he hugged her, her body felt cold, distracted, as if her mind were still elsewhere, with someone else. But he said nothing. He kept his strangeness to himself, trying to find the fault within himself that wasn't his. As the weeks passed, the small signs became less invisible. The new perfume, stronger, bolder, different from what she usually wore. The way she applied more careful makeup to work, the more fitted dresses, the smile that appeared at the corner of her mouth when she read messages on her phone and, without realizing it, let out an expression of enchantment he hadn't seen directed at him in a long time. There were days when she left without even leaving breakfast untouched. Others when she invented dinners with colleagues, get-togethers, educational events that seemed to appear with a strangely convenient frequency. And even then, Daniel tried to ignore them. He tried to maintain the balance of someone afraid of slipping over the edge of an emotional abyss. But what hurt most wasn't the physical absence. It was the disappearance of affection. Julia had become distant, almost polite. Her goodnight kiss was dry, conversation was rare, and her words came with a neutral tone, devoid of emotion. There were no longer any questions about how his day had been, no interest in his plans. She listened, but without hearing. And Daniel began to live in waiting mode. He waited for her to return to her former self. He waited for the weekends to be the same as before. He waited for her to look at him again as if she were home, not as if she were a stranger sitting on the couch. He waited. Because those who love don't give up immediately. But time, the very thing that had brought them together, now seemed complicit in a slow, silent, inevitable separation. One Saturday afternoon, while organizing some papers in the home office, Daniel found an envelope tucked into one of the drawers. It wasn't common for Julia to leave personal things there. Curious, he opened it. It was an invitation to a restaurant, a private event with a select few guests. There was a hand-scrawled note in masculine handwriting, to repeat that unforgettable night. Daniel felt his stomach sink. Not because of the wording, but because of the instant recognition that the note wasn't for him. That handwriting, that choice of words, that tone, they weren't his. He put the envelope back in its place. He said nothing. But that night, as Julia slept beside him, her body turned to the other side of the bed, he looked up at the ceiling and, for the first time, knew he was alone. In the following days, Daniel began to observe more. To notice details he'd previously tried to ignore. She smiled at her cell phone frequently. She changed her clothes more than once before going out. She wore lipsticks he'd never seen before. She avoided eye contact when he asked simple questions. "How was your day? Are you coming back late? Who's going to be at that dinner?" The answers came vague, quick, rehearsed. Julia moved away with each gesture, yet she continued to sleep beside him. It tortured him. The idea of sharing a bed with someone whose heart already resided elsewhere. The fear of confirming the betrayal was almost as strong as the pain of intuiting it. Daniel then decided to stop relying solely on impressions. He wanted the truth. He needed the truth. He called a mutual friend, someone discreet, sensible, who had always cared for them both. He tried to talk, to gather some information, but she brushed him off. She was polite but evasive. And this only confirmed what he already knew: it was no longer a matter of suspicion, it was a matter of evidence. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat on the living room sofa, with the lights off, listening to the ticking of the clock and wondering where everything began to fall apart. He wasn't perfect, he knew that. But he never failed. He never cheated. He never stopped loving. And now he was there, a shadow of himself, trying to pick up the pieces of a love that was being secretly crushed. The following week, he decided to discreetly follow Julia on one of the nights she claimed to be having a school get-together. He got in his car, turned off his cell phone, and kept his distance. He watched her enter a restaurant that definitely didn't fit the work environment. He waited. And 20 minutes later, he saw a man appear. Well-dressed, confident, a smile on his face. He greeted Julia with a kiss on the cheek that lingered a little too long. They sat close together, she laughed, and touched his hand across the table, as if she had been doing this for some time. And there, outside the glass, Daniel knew he had lost. Not just her. But everything he believed about what they had. He didn't cry. He just took a deep breath and left. He arrived home before her. He sat on the bed, stared at the white wall of his room, and for a few minutes, thought nothing of it. He was numb. When she arrived, still with the remnants of her perfume mixed with the smell of wine, he tried to act as if nothing had happened. But he already knew. That night, there was no conversation. Only silence. A painful, charged, definitive silence. And the next day, even before breakfast, he sat across from her and asked, "How long has this been going on?" Julia froze. Her eyes widened, and her expression was like someone being punched in the chest. She asked what he was talking about, her voice hesitant, almost childish. Daniel didn't answer. He just took out his phone and swiped the screen until he found the image he'd captured, her and the other man, face to face, smiling as if the world were perfect. He showed it. He waited. She said nothing. She simply lowered her eyes, as if she'd finally understood she'd been caught. He stood up slowly. His voice cracked, but without shouting, he said, "I loved you with all my heart, but apparently I wasn't enough." I hope you're very happy. He grabbed his keys and wallet and left. No slamming of the door, no scandal. Just with a broken heart and his dignity intact. On the sidewalk, he breathed in the cold night air. He felt a kind of bitter peace. It wasn't relief. It was pain. But a pain accompanied by clarity. For the first time in a long time, he was free from a lie. He walked aimlessly, trying to understand where he'd lost his way. If it was because he was too kind, too predictable, too calm. Or if, perhaps, the problem had never been him at all. Because there are people who confuse stability with boredom. And they trade certainty for empty promises, thinking love is adrenaline, not construction. What Daniel didn't know was that the worst was yet to come. That behind that betrayal lay something deeper. Something Julia had kept secret. Something he hadn't imagined. But that, very soon, would change everything. Time passed like fine sand, slipping through Julia's fingers without her realizing the real loss she had caused. In the first days after the separation, she maintained her appearance intact, telling herself that she had done what she needed to do, that she was free to pursue what made her feel alive. She pretended to her friends that she was fine, to her parents that she was lighter, to her lover that she was happy. But in the silence of cold nights, when she returned home and saw the empty spaces, when she sat alone on the sofa where she had so often laughed beside Daniel, doubt began to creep in slowly, like an icy wind through cracks she tried to ignore. The other man, the one who promised passion and brilliance, no longer made any effort to hide his disinterest. The messages became spaced out, the encounters lacked warmth, the dinners transformed into monologues of Julia trying to keep alive a flame that was never love, just fleeting desire. She realized, too late, that she had given her heart away for a reflex, an illusion dressed in intensity. It was on a random Tuesday, leaving a failed date with that man, that she felt the true weight of regret for the first time. She was sitting in the car seat, staring at the steering wheel, unable to bring herself to turn it and drive away. Her hands trembled slightly, and it wasn't from the cold. It was from emptiness. From the knowledge that she had destroyed something real for something shallow. She grabbed her phone, logged on to social media for the first time in weeks, and searched for Daniel's profile. He never posted much, but that day, there was a recent photo. He was in a cafe, smiling, next to a woman with a calm gaze and a familiar face. Julia tapped the image. She recognized the woman. She couldn't remember her name, but she remembered the feeling. She had heard Daniel talk about her years ago. A former ex from his youth. In the caption, he simply wrote, "Some twists and turns in life bring us back to what really matters." Julia couldn't take her eyes off that image. She looked so natural, so much a part of him, as if she were where she should always have been. Julia's heart clenched in a way it hadn't clenched in a long time. It took her 2 days to work up the courage to call. The call went to voicemail. She tried again the next day. Until, late on a Friday afternoon, the phone rang back. His voice on the other end was calm. Unhurried, with no obvious hurt. She asked to talk. Said she needed to. He hesitated for a moment, but agreed. They met in a discreet park, far from everything they knew. When they met, Julia felt her chest tighten. Daniel was different. There was something stronger about him, a presence that had been subtle and was now firm. She tried to smile, but her words stalled. He politely waited. They sat on a wooden bench, close together, but with a space between them that seemed millimeter-wide and, at the same time, impassable. Julia took a deep breath. She said she didn't know where to begin. That she had thought of 1,000 ways to apologize. That she didn't expect to be forgiven, but she needed to say what she felt. She spoke of the mistake. Of how much she had lost herself trying to find herself. She said that the relationship she had after the separation was superficial, painful, a reflection of her own confusion. She said that he, Daniel, was the only one who truly knew her. That his love was solid, rare, difficult to find again. Her eyes filled with tears with every word. Daniel listened to her without interrupting. When she paused, perhaps expecting a hug, a word that would open the door to a new beginning, he spoke. He said he didn't hate her, that there was no resentment. That she would always have a place of affection in his story, because what they had experienced would not be erased. But he added, in a calm voice, I had to rebuild myself from scratch, Julia. And in that reconstruction, I found someone who truly saw me. Today, I am a man at peace. And the peace I found, I don't want to lose anymore. Julia felt a silent blow to her stomach. She looked away, trying to hide the pain. She said she understood, but it was clear she wasn't ready to accept it. Still, she respected him. She said goodbye with a short, dry, almost symbolic hug. Daniel stood, said, "Take care of yourself," and left. She stood there, alone, her heart in ruins, feeling for the first time what he must have felt that night she betrayed him, not only with her body, but with her lack of loyalty, with the shattering of everything they had built. But what Julia didn't yet know was that the worst was yet to come. A few days later, she ran into the woman in the photo with Daniel, by chance, in a coffee shop. The two stared at each other for a few seconds, and the woman, with a slight smile, approached. Julia tried to be cordial. The other woman, calm, struck up a conversation. And without beating around the bush, she uttered the sentence that made the ground disappear beneath Julia's feet. She said that, when they were still young, she had had an intense relationship with Daniel, but that he ended the relationship because he was in love with another woman. And she added, "You." Julia felt her blood run cold. She tried to process it. The woman continued, "He pulled away from me when he met you. He said he needed to try something real with you. That he felt something he'd never felt before. I was devastated for months. It wasn't until years later that I realized how much he believed in you too." Julia's head spun. The woman's voice sounded distant, as if underwater. The air seemed thin. The pieces began to fall into place, each one stabbing a knife into her conscience. While she lived with Daniel, he had abandoned a great love for believing in her. For betting everything on that relationship. He chose Julia when he could have taken an easier, more predictable path. And she, years later, destroyed that for someone she never intended to stay with. She didn't just betray Daniel. She trampled on the sacrifice he had made to be by her side. The betrayal was greater than she realized. She destroyed a choice made with a pure heart. She left the coffee shop trembling, her hands sweaty and her face pale. She stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, unsure of where to go. The woman's words repeated in her head like a cruel echo. Daniel had left a true love to live with her. And all she had done was throw it away. It was there, in that moment, that Julia understood there was no going back. That she had lost more than a marriage. She had lost the chance to be the person someone dreamed of building a life with. She had lost the honor of being the destiny of someone who chose her when she had every reason not to. And that kind of loss cannot be repaired. At the end of that gray afternoon, Julia didn't return home. She drove aimlessly, her eyes still wet and her mind numb from the words of the woman who, unknowingly, had revealed the cruelest of truths. Daniel had given up a profound love to bet everything on her. She, now feeling empty, felt hollow, unable to hold on to anything without letting it slip. She stopped the car somewhere, a nearly empty parking lot at the edge of a park, where the sound of leaves scraping against the ground seemed to echo within her chest. For long minutes, she stood there, motionless, trying to understand how she had let her own life slip through her fingers. She no longer cried. It was as if the tears had dried from shame. From the realization of the damage. A regret that now didn't ask for forgiveness, it asked for silence. 2 days later, still unsure how, she decided to pursue Daniel once more. Not out of hope for reconciliation, that had already been crushed on that park bench, but out of a need to find some semblance of dignity, perhaps even some meaning in all of this. She discovered he was attending a charity event that weekend, organized by a mutual friend. It was a public setting, and she knew she wouldn't be stopped. She hadn't planned what she would say, but she felt the need to look him in the eye again, even if only to confirm that he had truly left completely. The hall where the event was taking place was simply decorated, but there was something welcoming about the atmosphere. People were smiling, conversations were lively, music was playing in the background. She entered discreetly, silently, like someone invading a place that no longer belongs to them. She searched among the tables and found him in the back, chatting with a few people. He looked different, more relaxed, with a calm gleam in his eyes. And beside him, the same woman from the photo. His ex, now present. Julia watched them for a few minutes. The way he listened to her, with sincere attention. The way she held his arm as she laughed. Small gestures, but they said everything. It was care, it was reciprocity. It was the kind of love she threw away without knowing its value. He decided not to interrupt. He turned to leave, but at that exact moment, he saw her. Their eyes met. And for a moment, everything stopped. He said goodbye to the conversation and walked toward her with firm, calm steps. Julia held his gaze. She wanted to show that she wasn't there to ask for anything. Just to see up close what remained between them. When he stopped in front of her, there was no hug. Just a slight nod. She broke the silence. I needed to see you again. I know, he replied, with a calmness that disarmed her. She tried to smile, but emotion weighed heavily on her eyes. I heard what she told me. About what you left behind when you chose me. About how you gave up an old love, for me. I never knew, Daniel. I never knew anyone had loved you so much before me. I never knew you gave it all up because you believed in me. He took a deep breath. His eyes fixed on hers, without harshness, but also without escaping. I loved you with everything I had. Not for what you could give me. But for what I saw in you. I thought it was forever, Julia. But we never know. And even today, after everything, I don't regret having loved you. I only regret what you did with that love. She nodded slowly, as if accepting a verdict. The hardest part is knowing that the purest love I ever received, was the one I destroyed. He didn't answer immediately. He just looked at her, silently, as if respecting another's pain even when it's the result of their own choice. Then, in a firm, low voice, he said, You didn't lose me because you betrayed me, Julia. You lost me when you stopped seeing me as someone worth protecting. The betrayal was just the final straw. The separation began long before that. His words stung like needles. They weren't spoken in anger, but with a clarity that hurt more than any scream. She then looked at him with the sincerity of someone who no longer had anything to hide. I didn't come here to try to get back. I know there's no room for me in your life anymore. I just needed to acknowledge. Out loud. How much I failed you. And thank you. For loving me like that. For believing in me when I didn't even believe in myself. Daniel smiled with his lips, not his eyes. Sometimes, we only learn the value of things after we lose them. I learned that too, but in a different way. I learned that you can't build a relationship alone. And that the most beautiful love is the one that chooses you without having to change you. She took a deep breath, as if releasing an old pain. She looked at him again, and at the woman waiting for him in the distance. She always waited for you, right? She always knew who I was. And even when I left, she never tried to make me someone else. Julia didn't answer. He just nodded, his eyes shining. He turned and walked toward the exit, feeling that each step was a final goodbye. There was no anger, no anguish. There was only the bitter silence of someone who understands that time doesn't come back. That lost opportunities are sometimes definitive. And that when someone chooses you over their own past, it's because they truly love you. And you don't throw that away for a moment of vanity. In the days that followed, Julia withdrew into herself. She stopped trying to explain herself to others. She let go of appearances. She began to live more simply, less hastily. Not because she expected forgiveness, that forgiveness had already come, but because she understood she needed to forgive herself. Not for having made a mistake, but for not having seen love when it was there, wide open, pure, available. And perhaps this was her penance, carrying the knowledge of her poor choice for the rest of her life. Meanwhile, Daniel continued his life in a different direction. The bond with his new partner grew stronger every day. There was no rush, no elaborate plans. Just the tranquility of rebuilding oneself alongside someone who knows the pain and chooses to stay anyway. The two walked together with sincere steps, sharing silences, listening to memories, respecting scars. They didn't need grand demonstrations. Just the truth. And that, after all, was non-negotiable. A few months later, on a solitary walk, Julia happened to come across an elderly couple sitting on a park bench, holding hands. She stopped, observed. And smiled. Not with sadness, but with a discreet serenity. For the first time, she felt that understanding what she had lost was part of what she needed to carry. Not as punishment, but as awareness. Because some loves, once lost, never return. And that doesn't make them less important. It just makes them eternal, inside. Julia returned home after that encounter at the event with the feeling that something inside her had finally quieted. It wasn't relief, nor was it peace, but an inevitable acceptance, like someone who understands that everything that could be done has already been done, and that any gesture from then on would merely be an empty attempt to postpone what was already resolved. She walked slowly through the apartment door, crossed the hallway with the echoes of the conversation still in her head, and sat on the sofa as if saying goodbye. She stayed there for hours, looking at the space around her, each object becoming a silent reminder of what had been lived, what had been discarded, and what would never return. The house seemed too big now, too silent, as if the atmosphere itself had changed its tone since Daniel had left. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to be alone, without distractions, without excuses, without escapes. And what she found in that silence was crueler than any argument, the knowledge that she would never be the same woman again, because the mistake she had made had transformed her forever. The following days proceeded with the cadence of a life that must continue even without knowing where to begin again. Julia returned to work, faced stares and silences, lived with the weight of her own reputation between those who knew too much and those who pretended to know nothing. As time passed, the betrayal that had once been a whisper between the lines became nothing more than an uncomfortable memory. Life, as always, went on. But within her, the mark remained. It was visible in her gestures, in the way she avoided certain places, in the way she looked in shop windows and remembered Sundays with Daniel, in the songs she exchanged before the melody reached the chorus. Everything seemed to carry a bit of him. Love didn't haunt her with longing, but with the guilt of someone who recognizes they had everything and chose nothing. Meanwhile, Daniel was finding new ways to shape his routine. With his wife by his side, he wasn't seeking to replace the past, but to build something different, more mature, more truthful. They knew each other from another time, from a youth marked by promises that couldn't be fulfilled, but which now, under different circumstances, returned with a deeper meaning. They walked slowly, respecting each other's time, their fears, their wounds. There was no pressure, no rush to prove anything. It was a love born of recognition, of calm, of listening. Daniel, more self-aware, no longer tried to save anyone. He simply offered his entire presence, and that was enough. With her, he didn't need to fear abandonment disguised as freedom, nor wonder if it was enough. For the first time, he was clearly chosen. And that transformed everything. But behind this new phase, there was still an unresolved dilemma. Julia, despite being distant, still existed. She was still part of the journey that brought him there. And Daniel, as firm as he was in his new life, knew that chapter could not simply be ignored. There were scars that don't heal with distance. Certain pains need to be named so they don't fester inside. And at some point, he understood that his reunion with his ex hadn't been closure, but rather the beginning of a deeper process of liberation. He needed to allow himself to forgive her, not for her sake, but for his own. He needed to transform what had been suffering into learning. Because only then could the love he felt now be experienced with true freedom, without shadows. Then, on a rainy late afternoon, he wrote a letter. Not a letter of reconciliation, nor of sorrow. It was an honest, human text, clearly expressing the feelings that had run through him since discovering the betrayal until that moment. He wrote about the pain, the disappointment, the silent anger, but also about the growth, self-knowledge, and gratitude that arose from the rubble. He said he would never forget what they had experienced, but that he now understood that true love cannot survive where there is self-denial. And that, as difficult as it had been, he was glad he had taken a different path. He carefully folded the letter, put it in an envelope, and left it at the entrance of the old building where she lived. He didn't expect a reply. It was just the final act of a cycle that needed to be closed with dignity. Julia read the letter that same day. Sitting on the same porch where she had so often sat alone, staring at the street in search of answers, she now held in her hands what she hadn't expected. Daniel's words weren't accusatory. They were fair, thoughtful, profound. Each sentence seemed to touch a specific point in her memory, her guilt, her longing. She read and reread it, until she had memorized the passages. And she cried. But not like before. Not with despair or anger. She cried with the knowledge that, in that paper, there was not only the end of their love, but the greatest proof that she had been loved by someone rare. And that she would never find a love with that kind of clarity again. Then she began to change small things. She cut her hair, redecorated the living room, removed the last paintings from the wall that still carried the memory of what was no longer there. She resumed old hobbies, sought out courses, and immersed herself in volunteering as a way to rediscover meaning. He wasn't seeking redemption. He was seeking purpose. Because she knew his happiness wouldn't be hers, and that she would need to find a path alone. She accepted the consequences of her own choice. And even though no one else judged her, she forced herself to remember, daily, what she lost, not to torture herself, but to remember the value of truth, presence, and loyalty. Daniel, for his part, continued to cultivate the present. Each gesture from the woman at his side was a different response than the one he'd received before. And he felt the difference. He felt seen. He felt safe. Little by little, he allowed himself to dream of the future again, no longer as an attempt to make up for the past, but as a celebration of what was real. Love, now, was no longer a refuge from pain. It was the foundation of reconstruction. And he knew, with a certainty beyond doubt, he had made the right choice. Because some people learn to love only after they've lost. Others love from the start, but spend their lives waiting to be loved in return. This time, he was loved in return. And that was all. In casual encounters with acquaintances, Julia began to talk less about what she'd experienced. Not out of shame, but because she no longer needed others' validation. When she was reminded of Daniel, she smiled respectfully. She didn't allow herself to dwell. She simply held the memory with the weight it deserved. A memory that shaped who she would become from then on. At night, she sometimes wrote in her journal. I wrote letters I didn't send. I wrote stray thoughts, reflections on choices, regrets, and the hidden beauty in accepting the consequences of one's freedom. It was an intimate, silent, but essential exercise. There, she created an inner space where forgiveness, little by little, began to blossom. Forgiveness for having been blind. For having allowed herself to be seduced by the ephemeral. For having hurt someone who only wanted the best for her. It was the beginning of a more mature path. A path that, though lonely, was being walked with greater awareness. Now, as time passed, the days seemed to carry a different kind of urgency. No longer the rush to be happy, but the desire to do things differently. Julia knew that nothing she built would ever taste the same as what she lost. But she also knew that this grief needed to transform into something. And she transformed it, little by little, silently, without fanfare. She learned that some people only teach us to love when they're no longer there. And that the greatest punishment isn't always abandonment, but the memory of who you were before those who truly loved you. And this mirror doesn't fade with time. It remains quiet. Like the memory of a name that was once synonymous with home. The arrival of winter brought with it a change in temperature that seemed to accurately reflect Julia's inner state. The streets became emptier, the days shorter, and the seasonal chill mingled with the loneliness that, though controlled, still occupied spaces within her. Her routine had stabilized, but stability was not synonymous with fulfillment. There were still moments when she looked at herself in the mirror and felt something essential had been lost, not just Daniel's love, but the version of herself that existed when he loved her. The image of the woman who had once been chosen over another, the woman who, for a brief time, was the center of a rare love, had dissolved in the mist of poor choices. Now, what remained was the woman rebuilding. Not the one seeking forgiveness from others, but the one struggling to forgive herself. This required more effort than she could have anticipated. One particularly cold night, Julia received an unexpected call. It was Daniel's mother. The voice on the other end was calm, as always, but with a firmness that betrayed a specific reason for the call. After a few seconds of hesitation, the woman explained that she needed to return some objects that belonged to Julia's family, old heirlooms that had been left in Daniel's home during their years of marriage. Julia accepted, thanked her, and arranged to come by her house to pick them up. It was a simple, practical gesture, but it made her chest tighten. She had spent months avoiding all contact with that group, not for fear of judgment, but because she didn't feel worthy of stepping foot where she had once been greeted with affection. Over the weekend, she arrived at her ex-mother-in-law's house at dusk, the sky tinged with orange and purple hues that gave the moment a simultaneously beautiful and cruel melancholy. She was greeted politely, and even without hugs, there was a kind of respect in the air, as if they both knew this meeting was part of something necessary. The woman handed her a small, carefully wrapped box containing some family jewelry, letters from Julia's childhood, and a photo album filled with memories she hadn't even remembered existed. As she held these objects, Julia felt time slipping away. They were pieces of a past she herself had destroyed, now returned like someone returning something that no longer belongs. Before leaving, her former mother-in-law looked her in the eye and said, in a low but firm voice, "You were very loved here. And I'm not just speaking for Daniel. I'm speaking for myself. I never understood what happened, but I've learned that everyone has their own battles. I just hope that one day you'll love yourself again the way he loved you." Julia felt the words lodge somewhere deep, between her stomach and her heart. There was no irony, no harshness. It was a gentle goodbye, perhaps even a silent blessing for her to move on in peace. On the way home, Julia drove without music, without distractions, just the sound of her own thoughts. When she arrived, she calmly opened the box. She took out the photos one by one, running her fingers over the smiling faces of a time she could no longer reach. She took out an old notebook, and between the pages found a note written by Daniel years ago, something he had once left in her bag: "I choose you today and every day to come. Not because you are perfect, but because you are real. And it is with you that I want to learn to be better." Julia closed her eyes and rested her head against the back of the sofa. There were no more tears, but there was no relief either. It was as if she were trapped in a state of absence. All of it no longer belonged to her, but it still shaped her. The following week, leaving a work meeting, she crossed the city center and saw Daniel walking beside his partner from afar. They were holding shopping bags, and the woman was laughing at something he had just said. It was a common, everyday image, but it held a truth no conversation could deny: they were together, and they were fine. Julia didn't look away. She didn't hide. She simply watched, with a dignity she could now sustain. They passed her without seeing her, and that, painful as it seemed, brought a kind of peace. It was the certainty that the story was moving on, even without her presence. She was now part of a closed chapter, not the current narrative. A few days later, she decided to visit a cultural center Daniel used to frequent. She knew he wouldn't be there that day, but she felt the need to reconnect with something that had belonged to them both. She entered the gallery and came across a photography exhibition about reunions and goodbyes. The images were simple but full of emotion. A father reuniting with his son after years. Two old friends who had lost each other in life and found each other by chance. A couple embracing at an airport gate. But there was one photo in particular that made her pause for long minutes, a man sitting on a park bench, gazing at the horizon, with the shadow of a woman receding in the background. There was no caption. But Julia understood what it meant. It was about staying after the other leaves. It was about learning to look forward even when everything inside you still insists on looking back. Leaving the gallery, she sat on a nearby bench and wrote a short text on her phone, one she would never send: "You chose me when no one else saw me. And I chose not to see you. Today, I understand that losing you was losing the chance to be someone better. But still, I wish you were everything I once couldn't be: love with presence, peace without demands, affection that doesn't hide. Thank you for being, even if only for a short time, my safe place." She read the text a few times, then deleted it. Not because it wasn't sincere, but because it no longer needed to be read. It was just for her. One Sunday morning, while making coffee, she received an unexpected call. It was Daniel's new partner. For a second, Julia considered not answering, but something made her press the green button. On the other end, the woman politely introduced herself, saying she knew the call might seem strange, but she needed to say something. She explained that, days before, Daniel had talked about everything he'd experienced, including his recent reunion with Julia. She said there were no secrets between them, and that's why she felt the right, or perhaps the obligation, to say what she felt out loud. She spoke with surprising calm. "I don't want you to feel diminished by everything that happened. I know the pain is yours, and I know you're the one who lost. But Daniel is okay now. He's whole. And I'm committed to taking care of him. Because what you two experienced, despite the end, was real. And out of respect for that, I want you to know that I would never take him from someone who still had him." Julia remained silent, absorbing every word like someone listening to some kind of unexpected goodbye. There was no rivalry. There was no dispute. There was only maturity, courage, and empathy. And perhaps that was what she needed most at that moment. The confirmation that Daniel was with someone who deserved him. Someone who, unlike her, understood the value of what she held in her hands. She thanked him with a choked voice, said goodbye sincerely, and as she hung up, she felt that chapter was finally closed. Not because someone said so, but because everything inside her finally acknowledged it. Night fell with a clear sky and a full moon illuminating the balconies of the buildings, the damp streets, and Julia's silent thoughts. Sitting on the windowsill, a cup in her hands, she gazed at the horizon with tired but conscious eyes. She no longer felt crushed by guilt, but neither did she delude herself with hope. She was finally faced with the most honest reflection of herself. And for the first time, she could look at the woman in the mirror without wanting to erase the past. Because she understood that it was precisely this past that taught her, every day, not to make mistakes again. To recognize love when it arrives. To not take affection for granted. To not confuse presence with obligation. Life's downward spiral has its own rhythm, and there, on that silent night, Julia understood that some stories aren't meant to be restarted. They're meant to leave lessons that last. That shape us. That prevent us from forgetting. And perhaps this was, after all, the only true form of redemption. Not to win back those who were lost. But to not lose anyone else for not having learned enough. Time passed, bringing with it a new season. Spring blossomed where before there had been only dry land and memory. Life, as it always does, moved on. But with it also came the maturation of destinies that previously seemed irretrievable. Daniel, now with a lightness born of lucidity, continued his routine alongside the woman he had chosen to love for the second time. Not as a repetition of the past, but as an authentic new beginning, built on mutual respect and mature complicity. The two began to share not only the days, but also the silences. Silences that no longer carried fear, but peace. He no longer woke with the anxiety of being enough, nor with the feeling of needing to prove something. For the first time in years, he felt whole simply by existing alongside someone who saw him completely, without trying to change him, without conditioning love to intensity or novelty. And in this space of tranquility, Daniel blossomed into his best self. Julia, on the other hand, carried the weight of a conscience that became an inseparable part of her identity. She continued her life, not as a woman waiting for a return, but as someone who understood that some losses are permanent. She reshaped her surroundings, distanced herself from old ties, and sought new paths that didn't depend on the affection of others for sustenance. Even so, there were moments when her heart wavered, like one late afternoon when the sun touched the window in a way similar to the days when she still shared her routine with Daniel. In those moments, she felt the impact of absence with a silent intensity. She no longer cried, but still carried that kind of pain that isn't expressed through tears, but rather through the knowledge that things could have been different. Not through empty regret, but through belated maturity. She became more sober, more thoughtful, more present. But what life taught her was that growing up isn't always enough to recover what was lost by not knowing how to love when one should. Daniel's ex-partner, now officially his wife, continued to be the link of balance Daniel had never had before. She had the wisdom of someone who had already lost, and the kindness of someone who didn't need to compete with ghosts. She never demanded that Daniel forget the past, but helped him reframe each pain as a stepping stone to the love they shared. With her, he learned that trust isn't demanded, it's built. And she, in turn, knew how to understand the weight of the scars without trying to erase them. When they married in a low-key ceremony, surrounded by only a few friends and family, there was no euphoria, no grandiose promises. Just calm vows, full of truth. I choose you completely, for everything you are and everything you've been. And if tomorrow hurts, I'll remember that true love doesn't disappear, it endures. These were simple words, but they resonated deeply in both their lives. On the same weekend as her wedding, Julia decided to take a trip alone, like she'd never done before. She took her car and drove to the countryside, to a small town where no one knew her. She wanted silence, not escape. Upon arrival, she stayed at a simple inn, where she spent the days reading, walking the trails, and watching the locals go about their slow, unhurried routines. At night, she wrote letters to herself, which she later burned in the fireplace. It wasn't a ritual, it was an attempt to cleanse herself internally. To forgive herself. One night, while talking to the innkeeper, a man with thinning hair and many smiles, she heard something that stayed with her for days. He said, with the calm of someone who's seen much of life pass by, some choices teach us by what they bring, others by what they take away. What matters is what you do with the pain afterward. Julia took this phrase as a silent guide. She might never have the chance to rebuild what she lost, but she could at least ensure she wouldn't destroy anything else for lack of knowledge of its value. Months later, back in her routine, Julia began participating in group therapy sessions. She didn't talk about Daniel. She talked about herself. How difficult it was to look in the mirror without wanting to erase her reflection. Gradually, she began to realize that her story wasn't about winning back a love, but about preventing someone else from making the same mistakes by ignoring signs, by neglecting affection. She volunteered on a project that supported women in relationship crisis, and there she found real purpose. She taught, with the authority of someone who had experienced the fall, that betrayal doesn't begin with the act, it begins when you stop caring for the other person, for yourself, and for the relationship between you. Daniel moved on with his life without ever erasing the memory of Julia. He did, however, keep a place for her in his memory, not as something unfinished, but as a profound lesson. He was grateful, because without that ending, he might not have rediscovered love in its most mature form. The marriage remained strong, not for lack of difficulties, but for the constant presence of communication. He now knew that fidelity went beyond the physical, it was also emotional, attentive, and spiritual. He understood that betrayal begins long before the bedroom. And he would never allow his new relationship to enter the same silent cycle of neglect. He learned, every day, to be present. And his presence was reciprocated. Years passed. And one ordinary morning, opening the mail, Julia found a small box with no return address. Inside was an old photograph. One of her and Daniel standing on a pier, their feet in the water and their faces turned toward each other, laughing. On the back, written in his handwriting, was a single sentence, "Thank you for being part of what made me who I am." Julia smiled, her eyes brimming with tears. There was no more pain, only gratitude. She tucked the photo between the pages of a book and, that day, went for a walk with light steps, knowing that, even without the ending she had once dreamed of, her story had finally found a place of peace. Now that the story has come to an end, with all its ups and downs, dilemmas, and painful truths, we want to hear from you. What did you think of this journey? Which part touched you most? Comment below, we'd love to hear your thoughts and reflect with you. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, intense, real, with feelings that truly touch us. And keep this final thought in mind, betrayal doesn't just destroy the other person, it destroys what's most valuable within ourselves. It tears away the foundation of trust, erases the beauty of surrender, and undoes the home two hearts build together. Those who betray don't just break promises, they destroy the chance for pure and true love. And there's no going back. This channel does not support, romanticize, or justify any kind of betrayal. Here, we tell stories that show what reality often tries to hide, that some bad choices can have irreversible consequences. See you next time.